Well, hello to you all. Lovely to be with you for our Good Friday message on Ganubi Methodist Online. Sacrifice is a word that evokes all kinds of images. It's not a benign word. It's a word that stirs us or perhaps disturbs us, especially when sacrifice may be expected of us. Because sacrifice is a word that demands something. It demands some kind of loss, that something be given up. Parents make sacrifices for their children, soldiers for their country, rescuers for victims. But sometimes even small sacrifices can have a huge impact. Like when someone swallows their pride to say, "I'm sorry," changing the entire trajectory of a relationship, or when an unexpected act of kindness saves somebody else from final despair. Actual sacrifice for another, especially an entirely voluntary sacrifice, can move a heart and impact a life in ways that words seldom can. Because sacrifice is that wordless cost that shows somebody else how much they matter. Our scripture for Good Friday comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15. And the title of today's message is Moved by a Sacrifice. May the Lord bless His word to our lives. Our passage for today is dominated by distress, duplicity, dereliction, darkness, and death. But there is this moving little verse amongst all that mayhem that always tugs at my heart. I'll read it from verse 39. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Here is a centurion, an experienced, battle-hardened soldier, commander of another 100 men, standing in front of Jesus to make sure that the death sentence is properly executed. It's likely that he had presided over other crucifixions, and he had stood and watched the violently tortured man called Jesus hanging from nails on the cross in front of him for the past 3 hours. But somehow, when Jesus died, the centurion was moved to say, "Surely this man was the Son of God." What could have moved this executioner to say this about the man he had just executed? Our passage doesn't give us the centurion's thought process, but considering that this wasn't his first execution, as well as considering the conduct of the two condemned men on either side of Jesus, there must have been something exceptional about Jesus' death that moved the centurion. Firstly, let's look at the exceptional circumstances. I would think that there were probably a combination of occurrences that somehow added up for the centurion. There were those obviously exceptional circumstances, like when darkness descended upon them in the middle of the day, and Matthew's gospel tells us that the earth shook and rocks split and tombs burst open when Jesus died. But then there were those other things that the centurion would have observed, like the curious way a convicted criminal called Barabbas was released from death row and without due process was replaced by Jesus. And what crime was Jesus convicted for? He hadn't broken any law or made any threats. It was the crowds who had called Jesus king when he rode into Jerusalem, but Jesus hadn't said anything like that. There wasn't even a proper trial. No defense was offered. All Jesus had to do to avoid an unbearably cruel execution was to deny the claims that others had made. But when Pilate asked him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" verse 2, Jesus stunningly answered, "Yes, it is as you say." Surely when faced with certain death, a man would deny those silly claims, unless they were true. Jesus made no attempt to defend himself, and he was willing to make the sacrifice. Then the centurion's squad pressed a crown of thorns into Jesus' head and mock honored him. "Hail, King of the Jews," verse 18. And they were hard men, so it could be expected of them. But then, during the drawn-out execution, the centurion watched the chief priests, people supposedly representing God, reveling in the torturous cruelty of another human being, mocking at Jesus' agony. What was all that about? We read in verse 31, "In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked Jesus among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he couldn't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. And then there was that signboard that stared at the centurion, stared him in the eye for all those hours that he stood in front of Jesus' cross. It proclaimed, "The King of the Jews." These were truly exceptional circumstances. But then secondly, we look at the exceptional person. Our passage tells us that the centurion's post was right in front of Jesus. He had hour after hour to observe Jesus hanging there. He noticed how Jesus refused the drink that would have eased his suffering, verse 23. He would have observed how other Jesus was compared to the cursing, blaspheming, defiant men crucified on either side of him. And then when one of those wretched men eventually turned to Jesus out of the blue and begged for divine mercy upon his soul, the centurion heard Jesus immediately push aside his own unbearable agony to grant this undeserving criminal the mercy that he asked for and promised him a place in heaven. What kind of man in such excruciating torment and with his own death upon him would keep up the pretense that he has the power to take people to heaven with him? Unless... And why would he say this to this man next to him when it would only subject him to even more ridicule? The clergy, the soldiers, the criminals, everybody mocked him as though he was the village idiot of the century. And so I'm sure that the centurion could hardly have believed his ears when he heard Jesus, through thirst-thickened tongue and cracked lips, softly praying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." The love of this man, the kindness of this man, so utterly deprived of love and compassion by everybody else, that he will look down from his own agony and plead with God to forgive his tormentors while they're still tormenting him. And then there was his final and awful cry from the cross. Verse 34, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This was the cry of a person throwing their whole being into one last thing, because besides this, nothing else mattered. My God, Why have you forsaken me?" With the conviction of utter authenticity, Jesus exhales those final words, proclaiming his untold agony at being abandoned by God. And while the centurion could not possibly have understood what that was all about, he was nevertheless intensely moved by the raw sincerity of that cry. It was the final piece that completed the puzzle of his experiences on that day. This had not been a regular execution. This had been an exceptional sacrifice, a loving, caring, compassionate, self-denying sacrifice for something far, far bigger than what they had done to Jesus on that day. It was this sacrifice that moved the centurion to conclude, surely this man was the Son of God. As we celebrate Good Friday today, we have the rest of the New Testament to tell us what the centurion had not yet known. Like Romans 5:8, which says, "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." The centurion was moved by Jesus' sacrifice just by seeing it. Through Jesus' sacrifice, God spoke directly into his soul. And through the eyes of Scripture, we're not only able to see Jesus' sacrifice, we're able to understand it. For example, 2 Corinthians 5:21 says of Jesus' sacrifice, "God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." We know what Jesus sacrificed. That final cry from the cross, that agony as Jesus carried the full weight of our sin in his own soul and took sin's punishment for us. Utterly banished by a holy God because he had become sin for us. Jesus' sacrifice, the sacrifice of his glory, the sacrifice of his body, the sacrifice of his being, it was all for us. And so as we celebrate Good Friday today, have you been moved by Jesus' sacrifice for you? Are we still being moved by his exceptional sacrifice for us? Every assurance I have that God has forgiven my sin, every relief I have that I will not be utterly cut off from God at my own death, every hope I have of being in heaven with Jesus is because of Jesus' sacrifice for me. Am I moved by his sacrifice? To rephrase Romans 12 verse 1 as a question for introspection, in view of God's mercy to me, am I moved to offer my body as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God as my true and proper worship? Am I moved to sacrifice my comfort, my reputation, my esteem, my own will, my own ways, my own wants, my own haves in worship of Jesus? Does Jesus' sacrifice for me move me to follow him in sacrificial living by forgiving the unforgivable, loving the unlovable, showing kindness to the undeserving, being merciful to the broken, reconciling the estranged, welcoming the outsider, and bringing the dying to find new life in Jesus? does Jesus' sacrifice for me move me to want to know him more, love him more, and live for him more? The hymn writer said it so brilliantly. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. God bless you.